Welcome to Big Breaking News of America. Genesis Episode 26. Historical and Archaeological Context of the Joseph Narrative, Genesis 37:50. The Joseph Narrative, Genesis 37:50, concludes the book of Genesis with a cohesive, novella-like story of Joseph, Jacob's favored son, whose journey from betrayal by his brothers to becoming Egypt's vizier ensures the survival of his family and positions Israel in Egypt, preparing for the Exodus narrative. Set in the Late Bronze Age, c. 1500–1200 BCE, a period of Egyptian imperial power, regional trade, and cultural exchange, the narrative reflects a plausible historical milieu, supported by archaeological finds and textual parallels from Egypt, Canaan, and Mesopotamia. Likely finalized during the Babylonian exile, 587–539 BCE, the narrative addresses Judah's displacement, offering hope through themes of divine providence, Genesis 50:20, and reconciliation, Genesis 45:415. The historical and archaeological context grounds the story in the ancient Near East, enhancing its credibility and theological depth while connecting it to the covenantal promises of Genesis 12:1–3, land, descendants, blessing. This exploration examines the Late Bronze Age setting, exilic composition, archaeological evidence, textual parallels, cultural engagement, scholarly perspectives, and broader impacts, demonstrating how the historical context shapes the Joseph narrative's role as Genesis' conclusion and the Torah's bridge to redemption. 1 Late Bronze Age setting, c. 1500–1200 BCE. The Joseph narrative is set in the Late Bronze Age, a dynamic period marked by Egypt's New Kingdom, c. 1550–1070 BCE, characterized by imperial expansion, sophisticated administration, and cultural interactions across the Levant, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. The narrative's depiction of Joseph's journey from Canaan to Egypt, his enslavement, imprisonment, and rise to power, aligns with this historical context, reflecting regional migration patterns, Egyptian governance, and social practices. Egyptian New Kingdom context. The New Kingdom was Egypt's golden age, with pharaohs like Thutmose III, 1479–1425 BCE, and Ramesses II, 1279–1213 BCE, establishing control over Canaan and Nubia, as evidenced by the Amarna letters, c. 1360–1330 BCE, a diplomatic archive of correspondence between Egypt and its vassals. The Joseph narrative's portrayal of a powerful pharaoh, Genesis 41:40–46, who appoints a Semitic vizier aligns with Egypt's centralized bureaucracy, where foreigners occasionally held high office, as seen in the case of Apel, a Semitic vizier under Amenhotep III, c. 1390–1352 BCE, documented in Saqqara inscriptions. Joseph's role in managing grain storage, Genesis 41:47–49, reflects Egypt's agricultural surplus and granary systems, evidenced by archaeological finds at Pyramesses and Thebes, where mud brick storehouses from the 13th century BCE have been excavated. The narrative's 7-year famine, Genesis 41:27–31, parallels Egyptian records of periodic Nile failures, such as the Stela of Sehel, c. 1800 BCE, which describes a 7-year drought under Djoser, though from an earlier period. Egyptian cultural details: Joseph's marriage to Asenath, daughter of a priest of On, Genesis 41 hours 45 minutes, his Egyptian names Aphinath Paneah, and mummification practices, Genesis 50:2-3, match New Kingdom customs. On, Heliopolis, was a major religious center, and mummification, requiring 70 days, Genesis 50:3, aligns with Herodotus' descriptions, histories, 5th century BCE, and archaeological evidence of elite burials at Deir el-Medina. Canaanite tribal dynamics. The narrative begins in Canaan, depicting Jacob's family as semi-nomadic herders, Genesis 37:12-17, consistent with Late Bronze Age tribal life in the Levant, as seen in Ugaritic texts, c. 1400–1200 BCE, describing pastoral clans. The brothers' rivalry, Genesis 37:3-11, and trade with Midianites / Ishmaelites, Genesis 37 hours 28 minutes, reflect Canaanite social structures, evidenced by execration texts, c. 19th–18th century BCE, naming tribal groups and trade routes through Shechem and Hebron. Archaeological sites like Hazor and Megiddo reveal Late Bronze Age fortifications and trade goods, Egyptian scarabs, Cypriot pottery, supporting the narrative's depiction of Canaan as a contested region under Egyptian influence, as the brothers travel to Dutton, Genesis 37 hours 17 minutes, a known trade hub. Migration and Semitic presence in Egypt. The narrative's central event, Israel's migration to Egypt, Genesis 46:17, mirrors historical Semitic migrations to the Nile Delta, particularly during the Hyksos period, c. 1650–1550 BCE, when Asiatic rulers governed from avarice, Tel el-Dabeh. While the Joseph narrative is set later, the Hyksos legacy left a Semitic cultural imprint, evidenced by Tel el-Dabeh's palaces, Semitic-style burials, and Canaanite pottery, c. 1600–1500 BCE. The Amarna letters document Semitic groups, Peru, in Egypt and Canaan, some as laborers or mercenaries, paralleling Joseph's enslavement, Genesis 39:1, and the brothers' settlement in Goshen, Genesis 47:16, a fertile delta region suited for pastoralists, as confirmed by satellite imagery of ancient delta settlements. Social and economic practices. Joseph's enslavement via Midianite traders, Genesis 37 hours 28 minutes, reflects Late Bronze Age slave trade networks, documented in Egyptian reliefs, for example, Tomb of Horemheb, c. 1300 BCE, depicting Asiatic captives. His purchase by Potiphar, an Egyptian official, Genesis 39:1, aligns with household slavery practices, as seen in Papyrus Brooklyn, c. 1700 BCE, listing Semitic slaves in elite homes. Joseph's dream interpretation, Genesis 40:41, mirrors Egyptian reliance on one-eromancy, evidenced by Papyrus Chester BT3, c. 1300 BCE, a dream manual, and the Tale of Two Brothers, where a foreigner interprets omens. His economic reforms, Genesis 47:13-26, centralizing land under Pharaoh, resemble New Kingdom policies under Seti I, c. 1290 BCE, documented in land registers at Karnak. Historical plausibility. While direct evidence of Joseph is absent, the narrative's cultural and administrative details align with Late Bronze Age Egypt, particularly the 19th-20th dynasties, c. 1295–1070 BCE. Scholars like Kenneth Kitchen argue for a Ramesside setting, 13th century BCE, due to parallels with Pi-Ramesses, a delta capital mentioned in Exodus 1:11, though others, like Donald Redford, favor a Hyksos-era backdrop for Semitic influence. The narrative's anachronisms, for example, Midianites and Ishmaelites used interchangeably, Genesis 37 hours 28 minutes, reflect later editorial layers but do not undermine its historical grounding, as the Late Bronze Age milieu provides a coherent framework. 2. Babylonian exile composition, 587–539 BCE. The Joseph narrative was likely finalized during the Babylonian exile, a period of Judah's displacement after Jerusalem's fall to Nebuchadnezzar II in 587 BCE. This exilic context shapes the narrative's themes, addressing the theological and communal needs of an exiled audience while reinforcing the covenantal promises of Genesis. Exilic historical context. The Babylonian exile saw Judah's elite deported to Babylon, as described in 2 Kings 25:11-12 and Babylonian Chronicles, c. 6th century BCE, which record Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns. The exiles faced cultural assimilation and theological crises, questioning God's faithfulness amidst Babylonian dominance, as reflected in Lamentations and Psalm 137. The Joseph narrative's depiction of exile, Joseph's enslavement, Genesis 37 hours 28 minutes, imprisonment, Genesis 39 hours 20 minutes, and eventual restoration, Genesis 41:40–46, mirrors the exile's experience, offering a paradigm of hope. Joseph's rise from captivity to leadership parallels prophetic promises of return, such as 2 Isaiah's vision of restoration, Isaiah 41:11. Theological messaging. The narrative's emphasis on divine providence, encapsulated in Joseph's statement, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good," Genesis 50 hours 20 minutes, counters Babylonian imperial ideologies, affirming YHWH's sovereignty over human plans. This resonates with exilic texts like Ezekiel 37, which envision Israel's revival. The theme of forgiveness, Genesis 45:4-15, addresses communal fractures among exiles, encouraging unity, as seen in Jeremiah's call for covenantal renewal, Jeremiah 31:31-34. The covenantal promises, descendants, Genesis 47 hours 27 minutes, and land, Genesis 50:24-25, reassure exiles of God's faithfulness, linking to Deuteronomy's restoration, Deuteronomy 31:5. Literary and cultural shaping. The exilic composition integrates earlier oral or written traditions, possibly from the United Monarchy, c. 1000 BCE, or Divided Kingdom, c. 935–87 BCE, as suggested by source critics like Richard Friedman, who attribute Genesis 37:50 to the Yahwist, J, and Elohist, E, sources. The narrative's polished structure reflects scribal refinement in Babylon, where Judahite elites had access to cuneiform libraries, as evidenced by the Murashu archive, c. 5th century BCE. The narrative's engagement with Egyptian culture, for example, mummification, Genesis 50:2-3, may draw on exilic familiarity with Mesopotamian Egyptian trade, as Babylon controlled Levantine routes. The universal blessing, Genesis 12:3, fulfilled as Joseph saves nations, Genesis 41:57, counters Babylonian exclusivity, aligning with 2nd Isaiah's global vision, Isaiah 45:22-23. Archaeological correlates. Exilic Judahite settlements in Babylon, such as Tel Aviv, not modern Israel, but a Babylonian site, are evidenced by cuneiform tablets listing Judahite names, suggesting a literate community capable of composing Genesis 37:50. The narrative's hope for return, Genesis 50:24-25, parallels archaeological evidence of Judahite repatriation under Cyrus, Ezra 1, c. 539 BCE. The narrative's Canaanite setting, Genesis 37:12-17, reflects exilic nostalgia for the homeland, evidenced by seal impressions from Judah, c. 6th century BCE, bearing Hebrew names, indicating cultural preservation. Theological and cultural impact. The exilic context makes the narrative a theological lifeline, shaping Jewish identity through hope and unity, as seen in synagogue traditions emerging post-exile. It influences Christian and Islamic theology, with Joseph's exile resonating in narratives of redemption. Globally, the exilic hope informs diaspora literature and modern exile narratives, from Jewish history to refugee advocacy, bridging ancient and contemporary experiences. 3. Archaeological evidence supporting the narrative. Archaeological discoveries from Egypt and Canaan provide a material backdrop for the Joseph narrative, corroborating its cultural, administrative, and social details, though direct evidence of Joseph remains elusive. Tel el-Dabeh, Avaris. Tel el-Dabeh, identified as the Hyksos capital Avaris and later Pyrameses, is a key site for the narrative's Delta setting, Genesis 47:16. Excavations by Manfred Biotarch, 1970s-2000s, reveal a Semitic settlement, c. 1800–1500 BCE, with Canaanite-style houses, pottery, and burials, supporting the presence of Asiatic communities like Jacob's family. A palace complex, c. 1600 BCE, with a garden tomb, possibly for a high-ranking Semite, parallels Joseph's status, Genesis 41:40-46. Statues of Asiatic officials and scarabs with Semitic names, for example, Yaqub-ha, suggest cultural integration, aligning with Joseph's Egyptian name and marriage, Genesis 41:45. Egyptian inscriptions and reliefs. The tomb of Rekhmire, c. 1450 BCE, depicts Asiatic slaves and tribute bearers, paralleling Joseph's enslavement, Genesis 39:1, and the brothers' visits, Genesis 42:16. The Merneptah Stele, c. 1208 BCE, mentioning Israel in Canaan, places Semitic tribes in the region, supporting the narrative's tribal context, Genesis 37:12-17. Administrative texts, like the Papyrus Brooklyn, c. 1700 BCE, list Semitic slaves in Egyptian households, corroborating Joseph's purchase by Potiphar, Genesis 39:1. The Karnak land registers, c. 1290 BCE, document centralized land policies, resembling Joseph's reforms, Genesis 47:13-26. Canaanite sites. Excavations at Dutton, Genesis 37 hours 17 minutes, conducted by Joseph Free, 1950s, reveal a late Bronze Age trade hub with cisterns, possibly like the pit where Joseph was cast, Genesis 37 hours 24 minutes. Hazor and Shechem, mentioned in Genesis 37:12-14, yield fortifications and Canaanite altars, c. 1400 BCE, supporting the narrative's tribal setting. Trade goods, Egyptian faience, Mycenaean pottery, at Megiddo indicate Canaan's connectivity, aligning with Midianite/Ishmaelite trade, Genesis 37 hours 28 minutes. Grain storage and famine evidence. Mud-brick granaries at Pyrameses and Thebes, c. 1300 BCE, corroborate Joseph's storage system, Genesis 41:47-49, with silos designed for long-term grain preservation. Pollen analysis from the Nile Delta, c. 1500–1200 BCE, suggests periodic droughts, supporting the narrative's famine, Genesis 41:27-31. The Stela of Sehel and Papyrus Ipuwer, c. 1850 BCE, though earlier, describe famines and social upheaval, providing a cultural memory of scarcity that resonates with Genesis 41. Burial and cultural practices. Mummification, Genesis 50:2-3, aligns with New Kingdom elite burials, as seen at Deir el-Medina, where 70-day embalming processes are documented. Joseph's coffin, Genesis 50 hours 26 minutes, matches wooden anthropoid coffins from Thebes, c. 1300 BCE. Jacob's burial in Canaan, Genesis 50:5-13, reflects Semitic attachment to ancestral lands, evidenced by Canaanite-style tombs at Jericho and Hebron, c. 1500 BCE. Archaeological limitations. The absence of direct references to Joseph or Jacob's family reflects the narrative's focus on a small clan, unlikely to leave monumental evidence. Scholarly debates, such as James Hofmeier's support for a Ramesside setting versus Israel Finkelstein's skepticism of historical precision, highlight the challenge of verifying individuals. Anachronisms, like the term Pharaoh, standardized later, or Midianites, Genesis 37 hours 28 minutes, suggest editorial layers, but the archaeological data supports the narrative's broader cultural accuracy. Cultural impact. Archaeological finds inform Jewish liturgy, Vaichi, Christian exegesis, and Islamic narratives, grounding Joseph's story in a tangible past. They inspire biblical tourism, for example, Avaris, Hebron, and Media, PBS as the Bible's buried secrets, bridging ancient and modern worlds. 4 textual parallels in the ancient Near East. The Joseph narrative engages Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Canaanite textual traditions, adapting familiar motifs to convey its monotheistic theology and covenantal themes. Egyptian parallels. Tale of Two Brothers, c. 1250 BCE. This papyrus recounts a young man's rise from betrayal to prominence through divine favor, paralleling Joseph's journey, Genesis 37:41. The tale's emphasis on sexual temptation, similar to Potiphar's wife, Genesis 39:7-12, and dream interpretation resonates with the narrative's motifs, though Joseph's faith in YHWH distinguishes it. Papyrus Westcar, c. 1600 BCE. This text describes prophetic dreams interpreted by a wise figure, akin to Joseph's role, Genesis 40:41. The narrative's dream sequences, Genesis 37:5-11, 41:1-36, adapt Egyptian One-eromancy, emphasizing divine guidance over pagan divination. Sinuhe story, c. 1800 BCE. The tale of an exile who rises in a foreign land parallels Joseph's enslavement and ascent, Genesis 39:41, with both figures integrating into host cultures, Genesis 41:45. The Joseph narrative's focus on covenantal purpose transforms this motif, linking to Torah redemption. Mesopotamian parallels. Epic of Gilgamesh, c. 1800 BCE. The motif of a hero overcoming trials, like Joseph's imprisonment, Genesis 39:20, echoes Gilgamesh's quests, but the narrative's providence, Genesis 50:20, reframes human agency within divine will, aligning with Torah theology, Exodus 3:7-10. Akkadian wisdom texts, texts like Ludlul Belnemichi, c. 1300 BCE, explore suffering and divine restoration, paralleling Joseph's trials and rise, Genesis 37:41. The narrative's monotheistic focus contrasts with Mesopotamian polytheism, prefiguring Torah law, Deuteronomy 6:4-5. Canaanite parallels. Ugaritic Baal cycle, c. 1400 BCE. The cycle's sibling rivalries and tribal dynamics resemble the brothers' conflict, Genesis 37:18-28, but Joseph's forgiveness, Genesis 45:4-15, introduces a covenantal ethic, unlike Baal's vengeance, aligning with Torah values, Leviticus 19:18. Tribal blessings, Jacob's blessings, Genesis 49, adapt Canaanite poetic forms, as seen in Ugaritic blessings of clans, but their prophetic scope, for example, Judah's kingship, Genesis 49:8-12, foreshadows Torah tribal roles, Numbers 1:4. Theological adaptation. The narrative repurposes these traditions to affirm YHWH's sovereignty, with Joseph's leadership, Genesis 41:40-46, and reconciliation, Genesis 45:4-15, reflecting covenantal virtues, unlike Egyptian transactional ethics or Mesopotamian fatalism. The universal blessing, Genesis 12:3, fulfilled as Joseph saves nations, Genesis 41:57, transforms regional narratives into a global ethic, prefiguring Torah's vision, Leviticus 19:34. Textual impact. These parallels enhance the narrative's accessibility, shaping Jewish storytelling, Midrash, Christian exegesis, Acts 7, and Islamic narratives, Surah Yusuf 12. Globally, they inform comparative literature, biblical studies, and interfaith dialogues, highlighting shared cultural heritage. 5. Cultural engagement with ancient Near Eastern societies. The Joseph narrative engages Egyptian, Canaanite, and Mesopotamian cultures, reflecting their social, religious, and political realities while asserting a distinct monotheistic identity. Egyptian society. The narrative's depiction of Egyptian administration, Pharaoh's court, Genesis 41:1446, granaries, Genesis 41:47-49, and land reforms, Genesis 47:13-26, mirrors New Kingdom governance, as seen in the Wilbur Papyrus, c. 1147 BCE, documenting land distribution. Joseph's integration, Genesis 41 hours 45 minutes, reflects Semitic acculturation, evidenced by Tel El Dabe's mixed material culture. Religious elements, like the priest of On, Genesis 41 hours 45 minutes, engage Egyptian sun worship, but Joseph's monotheism, Genesis 41 hours 16 minutes, asserts YHWH's supremacy, prefiguring Torah exclusivity, Exodus 20:2-3. Canaanite society. The brothers' pastoral life, Genesis 37:12-17, and tribal conflicts, Genesis 37:18-28, reflect Canaanite clan structures, as seen in Ugaritic texts describing family alliances. The Midianite trade, Genesis 37 hours 28 minutes, aligns with Levantine trade networks, evidenced by Canaanite amphorae in Egypt. Jacob's blessings, Genesis 49, adapt Canaanite tribal roles, with Judah's prominence, Genesis 49:8-12, foreshadowing Torah leadership, Numbers 2, distinguishing Israel's covenantal identity. Mesopotamian influence. The narrative's wisdom motifs, Genesis 41:33-36, echo Mesopotamian court tales, like the story of Ahikar, c. 7th century BCE, but Joseph's divine attribution, Genesis 41 hours 16 minutes, contrasts with Babylonian reliance on omens, aligning with Torah theology, Deuteronomy 18:10-14. The theme of exile and restoration, Genesis 37:50, resonates with Mesopotamian displacement narratives, yet the covenantal hope, Genesis 50:24-25, sets it apart, prefiguring Torah redemption, Exodus 3:8. Cultural impact. This engagement shapes Jewish identity, with Joseph's story informing diaspora resilience and Torah study. It influences Christian and Islamic theology, with Joseph's leadership inspiring interfaith ethics. Globally, the narrative's cultural synthesis inspires literature, art, and archaeology, fostering cross-cultural understanding and biblical scholarship. 6. Scholarly perspectives and debates. The historical and archaeological context of the Joseph narrative sparks scholarly debates, balancing historical plausibility with literary and theological priorities. Maximalist views. Scholars like Kenneth Kitchen and James Hoffmeyer argue for historical plausibility, citing Tel El Dabe's Semitic evidence and Ramesside parallels, for example, Pi-Rameses, Genesis 47 hours 11 minutes. They place the narrative in the 13th century BCE, aligning with Exodus timeline, c. 1250 BCE, per Hoffmeyer. The narrative's Egyptian details, Mummification, Genesis 50:2-3, granaries, Genesis 41:47-49, are seen as authentic, supported by New Kingdom archaeology. Minimalist views. Scholars like Israel Finkelstein and Thomas Romer question historical precision, viewing Genesis 37:50 as a literary construct from the exilic or Persian period, 6th–5th centuries BCE. They argue that anachronisms, for example, Pharaoh as a title, and the lack of direct evidence suggest a theological narrative over historical record. The Hyksos setting, c. 1650–1550 BCE, is favored by some, for example, Donald Redford, for Semitic influence, but the narrative's polished style points to later composition. Balanced approaches. John Van Setters and Ronald Hendel propose a cultural memory model, where the narrative preserves historical traditions, for example, Semitic migrations, but is shaped by exilic theology. The Late Bronze Age setting provides a plausible backdrop, even if details are stylized. The narrative's engagement with Egyptian texts, for example, Tale of Two Brothers, suggests familiarity with ancient traditions, balancing literary craft and historical grounding. Theological implications. Regardless of historicity, the narrative's context serves its theology, with providence, Genesis 50:20, and covenantal hope, Genesis 50:24-25, addressing exilic and modern audiences, linking to Torah redemption, Exodus 1:15. The debates enrich interfaith exegesis, with Jewish, Christian, and Islamic scholars exploring the narrative's historical roots and universal themes. Scholarly impact. These perspectives inform biblical studies, archaeology, and theology, shaping academic curricula and public discourse. They inspire interfaith dialogues and media, ensuring the narrative's relevance. 7 broader cultural and theological impacts. The historical and archaeological context of the Joseph narrative influences Jewish tradition, interfaith theology, and global culture, grounding its themes in a tangible past. Jewish tradition. The Late Bronze Age setting informs liturgy, Ve'ishev Ve'ichi, with Joseph's exile and restoration shaping exilic hope and Zionist narratives. Archaeological sites like Hebron, Genesis 50:13, reinforce Jewish attachment to the land, as seen in modern pilgrimage. The exilic composition fosters communal identity, with Midrash emphasizing Joseph's providence, Genesis 50:20, influencing Torah study and ethics. Christianity. The historical context supports Joseph's typology as a Christ figure, Acts 7:9-16, with his trials, Genesis 37:39, and leadership, Genesis 41, resonating in sermons and art, for example, Tissot's paintings. The exilic hope aligns with Christian redemption narratives, Romans 8:28. Islam. Surah Yusuf, Quran 12, engages the narrative's Egyptian setting, with Joseph's piety, Genesis 39:7-12, shaping Islamic ethics and rituals. The historical context fosters interfaith dialogue, as seen in the Abrahamic Family House, 2023. Global culture. Archaeological finds inspire biblical tourism, avarice, Dutton, documentaries, for example, patterns of evidence, and literature, bridging ancient and modern worlds. The narrative's historical grounding informs exile narratives, from Jewish diaspora to refugee advocacy. The context shapes ethical discourse, with Joseph's leadership and forgiveness influencing leadership models and human rights frameworks, UN SDGs, 2015. Cultural impact. The historical context unifies religious traditions, informs interfaith initiatives, and inspires global narratives, ensuring the Joseph narrative's enduring legacy in art, ethics, and activism. 8. Contemporary relevance. The historical and archaeological context remains relevant, addressing modern challenges through the lens of the Joseph narrative's ancient setting. Migration and diaspora. The narrative's Semitic migrations, Genesis 46:17, resonate with modern displacement, 281 million migrants, UN 2023, with archaeological evidence, Tel el-Dabbe, informing refugee advocacy, highs. Joseph's exile, Genesis 37 hours 28 minutes, inspires diaspora resilience, as seen in Jewish and Muslim communities. Leadership and ethics. Joseph's administrative role, Genesis 41:40-46, grounded in New Kingdom parallels, guides modern leadership training, Wexner Foundation, addressing workplace ethics and diversity, Forbes, 2024. The exilic hope informs ethical frameworks, promoting justice and unity. Interfaith and intercultural dialogue. The shared historical context fosters dialogue, with Joseph's story uniting Abrahamic faiths in initiatives like the Abraham Path. Archaeological sites, Hebron, Avaris, promote cultural tourism, bridging divides, UN Interfaith Harmony Week, 2024. Cultural preservation. Digital platforms, Spheria, Alim, and VR Tours, Israel Museum, preserve the narrative's historical context, engaging global audiences, Barna, 2024. Media adaptations, Netflix series, and art, ADNES, reinterpret the ancient setting, ensuring accessibility. Relevance impact. The context guides modern ethics, activism, and dialogue, shaping policies, EU refugee frameworks, 2021, and cultural expressions, ensuring the narrative's relevance in a globalized world. 9. Synthesis, historical context as theological and narrative foundation. The historical and archaeological context of Genesis 37:50 grounds the Joseph narrative in the Late Bronze Age and exilic periods, enhancing its theological and narrative significance. The New Kingdom setting provides a plausible backdrop for Joseph's rise, migration, and leadership, supported by Tel el-Dabbe, inscriptions, and textual parallels, Tale of Two Brothers. The exilic composition addresses Judah's displacement, offering hope through providence and reconciliation, linking to Torah redemption, Exodus 1:15. Archaeological evidence, granaries, burials, Canaanite sites, corroborates cultural details, while textual engagement transforms regional motifs into a monotheistic ethic. Scholarly debates balance historicity and theology, enriching exegesis and dialogue. The context's cultural impacts shape Jewish identity, interfaith theology, and global narratives, addressing modern issues like migration and leadership. As Genesis conclusion, the historical context bridges ancient promises to Torah redemption, inviting all to engage its vision of faith, unity, and hope. Thank you for watching Big Breaking News of America. Make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell icon for more news updates. Share our channel with your friends and family members, leave a like for more videos and express your thoughts under comment section.